Jessica Fraser. I'm a lecturer at the University of Oxford.
Well, I'm Alistair McGrath and I'm the Andreas Idris Professor of Science and Religion.
I am Professor Dermot McCullough and my speciality is the history of the Church.
My name's Catherine. They call me an Associate Professor of Old Testament.
My name is Anthony Reddy. I'm the Director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture.
My name is Hindi Naiman. I'm the Royal Online Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture.
I'm Anna Sapir Abulafia, and here in Oxford I hold the chair of the study of the Abrahamic religions.
To understand religions is to understand so much about where people are coming from. If we understand that the word religion doesn't just mean one particular institution or one particular dogma, but actually the way we study it means the ideas and life that is shaping everything we care about for different people around the world. What's great about studying religion is you understand better where people are coming from. And so if you go to another country, go to the Middle East, if you go to Africa, if you go to Asia, you can come to it with a much clearer picture of who you're talking to, a much richer understanding of what you're engaging with. So for living in the global world, we need the study of theology and religion. One of the things that people sometimes say is that in the modern world, people are not as good as they should be at thinking carefully through the big issues. What is morality? What kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of person do we want to be? What is of highest value in the world? Theology and religion is the place where the big questions are asked, and students are given a chance to really explore those questions and find their own solutions, so that they're the ones who think deeply, and they're the ones who can engage deeply with all the debates that are shaping our society today.
I think theology is still relevant for two main reasons. One is that facing outward, engaging the public, people want to know what religious people think, where they get these ideas from, what difference they make. And therefore there's a sense in which theology is about the objective presentation of ideas, trying to understand how they've developed, where they've come from, and if they are right, what sort of difference they make. So that's very important, I think, particularly in an area where there's public debate about the utility of religion, things like that. Ideas really are very important. So I think theology should engage with the public domain because it's very important people talk about these ideas. But I think theology also has a very long established and important way of relating to religious communities. In my own case, I would talk a lot about Christian theology. So we'll be looking at the way in which this impacts on religious believers or Christian churches, and again trying to understand how best to explain these, how best to present these, how they might be preached, the difference that they make, how they lead into ethical conduct, and that kind of thing. So for me, I think, as society becomes less religious in one sense, theology actually becomes increasingly important because people really need to understand what it's all about, and that means we need people who are able to explain this both to communities of faith but also to a wider public which may not share these ideas but wants to know what they are.
Theology is relevant because people believe passionately in religion, and that means they have a theology. And very often it may not be a very well-informed theology. So it's useful to be able to comment in an informed way on what one hears from religious people and from non-religious people, and to understand the whole variety of the religious phenomenon. And I don't mean that in a confessional way. I don't mean Christianity, Islam, whatever. I mean that aspect of the human psyche which is invested in the other, you might say.
Try telling me how theology is not relevant today. Thinking of my own field of speciality, I'm a biblical scholar. So look at how the biblical texts can be, often misused. They can be stewarded and curated well. We can, learn about the material within them, but actually they can also be quite dangerously weaponized as a cheap source of authority. So, for example, look at the way Trump held up a Bible after doing a kind of Jericho march. But then, when he was asked about the Bible, he wouldn't say what his favourite part was. And then eventually he did say, don't bend to envy, but that's made up. That's not from the biblical texts themselves. Historically, things like the curse of Ham, this was used, a story from the flood narrative just afterwards, this was used to justify the slave trade, black slavery. Look at Black Lives Matters. These things, religion cannot be kept out of these things. So I think it's as well to acknowledge its role and try to educate people and enable them to think critically about the ways that religion plays into these things. So there's this kind of faux engagement with the Bible. It's just used as a kind of symbol that you can, as a kind of source of authority. And I'm quite worried nowadays about the way the biblical texts are used to support misogyny. Groups within the manosphere, incel groups, traditional Christian conservatives, often draw on biblical texts, to support ideas, to give their ideas the legitimacy and authenticity. So I think, theology and religion is very relevant today. And I think in my field specifically, it's something where I feel there is now a duty to speak publicly about, the way the biblical texts are being used.
Well, I think it's still relevant because it still speaks to the deepest yearnings of human beings. So whilst I think at one point, I think some scholars particularly, I think maybe sociologists and anthropologists, probably at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, might have presupposed that religion might be on the way out because it tends to be linked to kind of pre-modern thinking, pre-enlightenment, maybe when people were more superstitious and didn't have as many answers to the big questions, and so they would turn to religious frameworks and myths to help explain that. And so the assumption is that once we became more scientific and more objective and more knowing, in terms of just knowing more about the world and about the intricacies, then the instances of religious phenomena would decline. But actually it hasn't declined. And I think what that tells us is that there is still a way in which religion speaks to the deepest sense. Why do we love each other? Why do we want to live in community? The deeper questions of why and how to live are the ones that are still often provided by religion. And so actually most people in the world are theistic. Well, organised religion, and to be honest, maybe Christianity might be on the decline in Northern Europe, including the UK. That's not the case across the world. And so certainly in terms of Christianity, like the gravitational pull now tends to be the global south, so Latin America and the continent of Africa. Huge growths in Christianity, the growth in Islam, and the way in which that has become a much more nuanced understanding around identities. So when I was growing up, one would talk about people like myself as being African Caribbean, and would then talk about Asian people whose parents came from the Indian subcontinent, mainly India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, part of the old British Empire. And there was this largely, I think, unnuanced way of just calling everyone from that continent Asian. Increasingly now, amongst younger people are saying, actually, I'm Muslim. Or they're saying, actually, I'm Hindu, I'm Sikh. So there's a way in which those identities are not just religious identities, they're also socio-political and cultural identities, which therefore tells us of the growing significance of religion, not of its diminution.
To speak about the relevance of theology today is to speak about appreciation and deep understanding of religious tradition, each in its own context. It's to speak about the call to understand the other with love and compassion, but it's also to think critically both about traditions of hatred and violence against Judaism, against Islam, against Christianity, against Buddhism, against otherness. It's about, so to study theology is about studying religion and God from a position of love, but also from a position of humanity, and by which I mean that you and I are in conversation with one another to try to understand the other, but not try to convert the other, not try to transform the other, but to experience and to exemplify our own tradition as people under the heavens, citizens of the world, friends?
Well, if you look around to see what's going on in the world, I think it's more difficult to argue that religion doesn't play a role. It may well be that there is less interest in some areas in particular doctrinal views, whether they have to do with Christianity or Judaism or Islam. But the term religion covers much more than that, because religion is the whole question also of identity. And there are so many different areas in the world where religion specifically, explicitly plays a role to do with politics, with social activity, all kinds of things. But it doesn't always have to be explicit. It can be implicit. There's such a difference between what a religious tradition is and how people invoke it and what people do with it. And one of the most important tasks in the present world is that we stop trying to box everything in little tweets and actually try and think in a nuanced way. People might well say, I am doing this in the name of whatever tradition, but one shouldn't then have a knee-jerk reaction to that. One then has to think very critically, well, hang on, what does that tradition actually teach about violence, when a great wrong is being done, about all kinds of other things. And one needs to think critically about these things. I mean, we always tend, and I say this to my students all the time, we should stop thinking that there is one Judaism, one Islam, one Christianity. There isn't one church. I mean, it might be that at a certain point the papacy would like there to be one church, but there isn't. It isn't a homogeneous thing. There are all kinds of different views. There are political interests, there are doctrinal interests, there are social interests, and all of these are battling and working and interlacing with each other. And that's why it is so incredibly interesting. That's true for Islam as well. I mean, it's just a truism. It's so obvious that there isn't one Islam. But when you look in the media, you sometimes think, well, hang on, do people really think there is one Islam? And that's the sort of thing that our students and also the scholars in our faculty, that's the sort of things we tackle. And I think it's desperately, desperately important. There's so much talk in the media about Europe and about how somehow Europeans are always doing things in one voice, and it's, this is all Christianity and goodness knows what. But if you teach the Middle Ages as I do, and you actually think, well, hang on, let's get away from this Christocentricity, and let's actually think of what goes into European culture. I mean, you're talking about a huge contribution from Islam. You're talking about a really big contribution from Judaism.